some methodologies that we use to measure coral reefs. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. My one main joke, and there might be some side jokes, is this isn't going to be a results kind of scientific presentation. It's going to be a journey. We're just talking about methods, so just enjoy the entire way. We're not going to get to like an end of like these are the results today, but there's some cool stuff in the middle and then towards the end kind of thing. All right, so a little bit about some introductions and background about the Nature Conservancy, where I work, what we do, what our team is doing. So the Nature Conservancy, for those of you who aren't aware, is a global organization. We have about 5,000 employees worldwide, and they range on doing a really diverse range of conservation work and scientific research. We have terrestrial teams managing forests and maintaining grasslands. We have all kinds of scientific research going on, ranging from terrestrial work to marine work, developing methodologies. Here on Hawaii Island, we have a Hawaii Island marine team and the Hawaii Island terrestrial team. I work for the marine team, but do a little bit of work with the terrestrial team as well occasionally. And our marine team focuses mainly on working with communities, different partner organizations, government agencies to work together towards our main goal at the Nature Conservancy, which is to conserve the lands and water at which all life depends. And so our work mainly focuses on coral reefs and fisheries management, among a lot of other things. So today's talk, just to give you guys a little bit of like a precursor of what we're going to be getting into today, we're going to start off by discussing some past, some present, and then methodologies that we're using to assess and measure different types of coral. We're going to talk about structure for motion, what it is, how it works. I'll kind of define a lot of the major terms as we get into them. There'll be a little bit of a workflow on structure for motion. It won't be too lectury, I hope, / promise. But I'm not going to get super into the weeds, but if you have really specific questions at the end, feel free to get as specific as you would like with questions. We're going to look at different data products from these types of surveys, how we use them to assess corals, as well as different types of reef structure, some complementary data sets, machine learning, and then how we apply this to conservation and scientific research, and how it all comes together in the end, as well as some fun imagery that you guys will get to kind of engage with throughout parts of the talk. All right, so to start off with, I'm gonna go over the ways we measure coral. And so over the past probably 30 to 40 years, we've collectively, as a scientific and conservation body, as well as some really great citizen science work, all assess coral in a few really specific ways. And this generally has to do with we send divers or snorkelers out onto different reef areas. We roll out a transect line that's usually like 5 by 30 meters long, or in this case, it's 5 by 50 meters long. And we go out and we just measure all the different corals. We measure the species, we count everything. We assess the different types of coral health conditions. It's really just a ton of measuring that's happening underwater. And it can take an incredibly long time for the different types of surveys. At the Nature Conservancy, we just finished up a big push for some in-water surveys with divers. They were called Reef Resilience, where we went out and assessed 40 sites for coral health. And those surveys took up to 3 hours in a dive. It was us just underwater for 3 hours. We were doing up to 6 dives in a day. They got really intensive. So this is all just to say that when we put divers in the water, we collect really high resolution data, and it's really amazing because we have divers looking at corals. They're knowing that I'm looking at this species and I'm looking at this disease, which is really great, but it's super small scale. It's the extent of that transect, and it's the extent of that transect or the transects that are at that site. And so one of the ways that we try to complement these types of surveys and adapt these types of methodologies to be able to scale what we can say about coral reefs and to scale about seeing how reefs change over time is the survey that I'll be talking about today, which is called structure from motion. And so what structure from motion is, it's a type of fine scale remote sensing. And remote sensing is just to say it's a type of methodology that we use to collect imagery or some type of data from far away, something from like a satellite, from an airplane, helicopter, drones. It could be divers with a camera, then that get analyzed as allowed, would count as remote sensing. So this falls under that category. We take hundreds and thousands of photos of corals that overlap, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And when we do that, we're able to stitch them together to create 3D models just like you're seeing on the screen here. And we're able to scan the reef and take it home with us. And we're able to ask all those same questions that we were when we were diving on the reef for 3 hours. But this way, we're allowed to take that reef home and spend even more time. We can take a break while we're looking at the corals. We can go get like a bubbly water. We can really just like spend more time looking at the corals to making sure we're getting the best data possible. And as you can see with some of these, they're really high resolution. Like in these particular corals, you can get down to the polyps in resolution. So similar types of data we can get on the reef, we can get back at the lab as well with this survey. And these are as scalable or as diverse as research questions we have. So we can change the size of these 3D models. We can change the shape of these 3D models to fit whatever research question or project we're working on and help us get to those deliverables or conservation goals that we're working towards. All right, so this is where I'm going to briefly get into some of the weeds or the details of how we do these surveys. So if it doesn't make sense or if you have a question, keep it in your mind and I'll help answer it at the end because it gets a little bit complicated in this section. But the way we do these types of surveys, step one is photo collection. So the main thing that we use is any type of camera. It could be an iPhone camera, it could be a GoPro. The better the camera, the better the images. Usually the higher resolution the model will be and the higher resolution the surveys will be. And what we need to do with all these photos is we need to take them in a certain type of grid pattern. It could be these spiral ones that we're seeing on the top here. The most common one, and the ones that we use the most, are these kind of a lawnmower or gridded patterns that you see in the red in the middle there. Or if we're just looking at a colony, we'll do these kind of like Christmas tree spiraling surveys around. And those are the swim patterns or the camera movement patterns. It's called structure from motion because we're getting structure from the motion of the camera and how that camera changes and the perspective of that camera changes collects all the structure information. And so the way that we do these surveys is we need to get about 70 to 90% overlap from one picture to the next sequential picture and so on throughout that lawnmower pattern. So if we're starting down here in this section of the grid, we'll move up and down this lawnmower pattern and each red dot would represent a photo. And one photo to the next will have 70% of the same pixels from that first one to the second photo. And with this, we can use a variety of different types of algorithms and look at all of those pixels and say we have all these types of photo, or we have all these pixels that match other photos, and we know where the camera locations are in each of those positions, and we can stitch together a 3D model. So that looks something like this. Each one of these 4 rectangles represent, let's say, a camera. And if we're trying to create a structure of something like a building in this instance, we'll get into corals in a second, but a building was easier. We're able to see, let's say, this pink dot on that building in each one of these 4 photos. And because those photos are taken in different locations, we can triangulate that singular point and all of the other points in that surface that we're trying to scan in each one of those images that have those same matching points. And we can create what's called a point cloud. And these point clouds are kind of the base of where the 3D models come from. It's what you're looking at on this kind of like really coarse building point cloud here. But if you get enough of those point clouds and you have enough pictures with enough overlap, you can make something that looks like this of a reef structure.
Wow.
So what this is about 4,000 photos worth of during a survey, and you're looking at a couple billion points that create this 3D structure. So this one was taken a couple years ago at Kahalu'u, and this is kind of our flyover. This is the first stage, or really it's stage 2. This is the 3D model that we work with. So one of the things that we have to do to get different types of data products is we have to go from 2D images that we collect in the photo collection stage. We have to take them into a 3D model stage, and then we need to put them back into 2D images. So these are the main types of data products that we work with to collect coral information. And what this is on the larger image here is the 10 by 10 meter square, which is our most common kind of size that we work with the diver-based or snorkel-based methods. If you guys follow this black square, it kind of translates over and down. So we have the main zoomed out version. We have a slightly more zoomed in version where this is a meter scale. And then if we're just looking at that small black square on the top there, that's what you're looking at right here. And you can see, again, we get that really high polyp resolution to be able to assess corals. And so by doing this, we're able to kind of, again, it's taking the reef home with us and assessing it at kind of a longer term scale or even an expanded scale because we're able to look at more corals over a longer time period. Or if we use some quick tips and tricks, which I'll get into later, we can look at incredibly more corals at a much shorter time that I'm using some fun AI stuff, which I'll get into briefly. Now, the really important thing that I want to distinguish here is that when we have something like one of the 2D maps, which are called orthophotos or orthomosaics, these are pretty significantly different from your normal reef photo. So if we're looking at just a picture of a reef that we can take on one singular camera point, We might say that this is good enough. What's the difference between this? We could probably get coral cover from this photo, but we can't actually measure individual colonies when we're just looking at a camera photo. And that's because if we look at a coral on this portion of the photo, this bottom portion that's closer to us when we took the picture, the scaling of that individual colony is going to be different than the corals that are farther away on the reef, because we're looking at a 2D image of a 3D space. When we're looking at an ortho photo, we're looking at a 2D image that was put into a 3D model and then geo-rectified back into a 2D space. So we're able to look at any one of the corals on this map and say, I want to measure this coral, and I want to have the same spatial scale as the corals on the other side of the map and have those be comparable. And so when we go from those 3D point clouds that we just looked at to a 2D map, it kind of stretches and molds those different corals from 3D space back to 2D space, and we're able to flatten everything down and measure them across the plane in a really easy way. So right off the bat, the data products that we can measure corals with, or that we can pull from these maps, are really similar to what we do as divers or snorkelers when we're doing these types of surveys underwater, or in water surveys, in situ surveys. So right off the bat, things like coral cover is really easy to pull from these. The same way that we do it underwater, we can get coral, colony density, how many of each of the different species, how many of total colonies there are. We can do things like species diversity, colony abundance, coral health, and much more. It's really a wide range of questions we can ask because we're essentially just taking that reef home with us and we can ask questions later. Now, this next part is where it gets kind of tricky, and there's lots of methods development in this. But when we have the nice, pretty maps that are, geo-rectified, it's really nice to have these and to look at them. However, we don't just get data by looking at these maps. We have to do further analysis to be able to pull information from these maps, and that way we can put them into things like Excel or be able to do stats on them. We need to be able to summarize the data in ways and be able to actually do the surveys. And you can do this by just actually looking at the maps and counting all colonies, but this takes an incredibly long time. We used to do it, probably it wasn't that long ago, it was about 2 or 3 years ago, where we'd have people go in. It's usually interns and grad students. They would go in and basically with a pen or like on a digital pad, they'd go in and individually trace each colony. And this plot in particular has about 12,000 colonies in it. And as you can imagine, it takes an incredibly long time to trace 12,000 colonies. So what we've been working on developing over the past probably like 5 years, where we're really starting to get tired of tracing corals, is we're using artificial intelligence or machine learning to be able to automatically annotate all of these colonies for us. And so what we do is we'll go into a subset of this. We use programs like TagLab, which are ways that we can kind of trace corals in a fast way. It's like a machine learning assist, but we can trace a few of these colonies. We can tell it some of the different species, and we'll feed this data into a machine learning algorithm. And the machine learning software, it looks at the training data that we give it, it replicates that training data, and it tries to predict on that same training data set. And then once it gets up to about a 95% confidence interval of where it thinks it's a coral, it predicts it as a coral, and then we tell it, good job, you did it, have a treat, keep going. It'll start predicting corals from there. So on the top, these 2 top pictures are some of the mosaics that we fed it, and we said, predict what you think corals are in these. The colors don't represent different species, they're just representative of different colonies in this. But as you can see, it's doing a pretty good job. It gets about 98% success rate in terms of when it's calling a coral. Sometimes it calls dead corals too, but that's tomorrow's problem. But this takes that time from going and hand annotating and delineating those colonies by hand down by about 85%. Occasionally, we still have to do some cleaning involved. We like to go in and do like a quality assurance or a quality check to make sure that it's actually calling corals, a coral instead of dead colonies, live colonies kind of thing. But it's that last 15% that is very fast to do. We go in and we do some random selections on those colonies, and we check to see that they're actually what it's saying it is. And it really increases the amount of data that we can collect over a small time. And so what this looks like is we're able to pull all this information and predict on all these colonies. So that's that same map that we were looking at. All of the orange colonies are the Parietes lobata, or the lobe colonies, or lobe corals that we see off of West Hawaii. They're the dominant species here. So we just had to predict that species. And it does a really effective job. And from here, since we have all of these spatially referenced predicted colonies and maps of just where the colonies are. We can summarize this data really effectively. It's as simple as summarizing things in Excel, which is super fast. We can do it in all kinds of other programs as well. But we're able to take all these colonies, summarize it down. We can break it up into different types of size classes. We can break it up into the species distribution. We can get total coral cover. All those metrics I was talking about earlier can get pulled from these annotation maps from here. What else is really nice about these maps and doing some of the data products that we work with this is instead of doing those 3-hour coral health surveys that we were talking about, again, we can pull these back and do, once we have all the annotations, we can do coral health surveys from our computer screens. So we can go in and click on each individual colony that we want to. Let's say we're going to click on this lobata colony here in blue. We would have it pulled up with all of our different health conditions that we have on the side here. And on this particular colony, we can say it's got some pigmentation response. That's 0.5% of this colony. We've got some, what else do we have in here? We've got some algal overgrowth happening right here. And that's like, what, 1% I was saying? And then we've got a growth anomaly on the top that's about 4%. And then we can move on to the next colony and keep doing that. So instead of having, again, to spend, hours and hours on end staring at colonies underwater, which is really fun for, the first hour. But after you get past a little bit more, it gets really taxing. It's still not as fun staring at a computer screen, but it's a little bit easier. But some of the data products that we can pull from this is because all of these are still, again, we're geo-referenced, we're spatially scaled, we can take our reef mosaics that we're doing, we can take our annotation maps, and then we can apply all of that different health information in a variety of different ways in a mappable space. So in this case, we're taking those health conditions. All of the red colonies are in the middle here are ones that had some type of health condition. They had a disease, they had some algae overgrowth, there's some pigmentation happening that was weird, they had something, and we're able to map where those are. The one on the right here is a severity assessment. The darker colors are a higher severity health condition. The white colonies didn't have anything at all. And so in this particular concept for coral health work, it's really interesting in places like the Caribbean, where you have things like stony coral tissue loss disease, which is spreading and killing lots of corals. We can do these types of surveys in temporal timestamps, so multiple different surveys at the same spot, and we can see how different types of diseases are moving across a reef, and that kind of spatial movement of disease and whatnot is just one of the applications we can do with this. So far I've talked a little bit about the diver-based application of structure from motion. But like I was saying in the beginning, you can do this with just about any camera. It doesn't really matter the type of camera or the quality of the camera. Again, like I was saying, the better the camera, the better the photos, the better the model. But if you're doing this just kind of for fun, you can do it with whatever camera. You just have to be able to mount it or be able to control the overall distribution of how you're taking photos. So people have done this with divers, they've done it with drones, ROVs are really common. People have stuck them to the bottom of boats and driven around and gotten 3D models that way. There was one paper that did it with hot air balloons. That seemed really exciting. It was really expensive per unit area to measure, but it works. And helicopters are really common. They've done that across West Hawaii a few different times. So one of the things that we're working a lot with the Nature Conservancy right now is scaling our structure from motion surveys with drones. And one of the really nice things about using drones and some of the higher end drones that are coming out that are also, as the technology increases with drones as well as it increases with structure from motion, it gets cheaper and cheaper to do these surveys and collect more data at a lower price range and at a larger area. So instead of collecting data at a 10 by 10 meter kind of square area that we were doing with divers, we can now look at a few hundred acres of area at a time using a drone. Drones are also really high resolution, and they're much more repeatable than they are with divers. Most drones have built-in GPS in them, so they can link a GPS point to to that photo, and it allows us to just put that photo in that GPS point over and over and over again, so we can get really high resolution change over time and at a really large scale. Prior to, it was like March, April this past year, we had been talking a lot at the Nature Conservancy and a lot with our local agencies and federal agencies about a potential bleaching event that may happen in 2023. How most of you might know, we're not really experiencing any major bleaching right now. There was a big bleaching warning that got put out, but it didn't kind of pan out. Things cooled off, which was really good to hear for corals. However, we did have a whole bleaching plan, and that was to use drones to map huge amounts of area of West Hawaii's coastline and try to assess bleaching from the beginning of that event, during the event, and after that event, kind of track throughout that section how many corals died, how many corals were affected by bleaching, and then what did the reefs look like after. Since it didn't happen, we decided we're still going to go out and collect the data anyways. This is this big field push that we're doing right now. It's going out. We have a whole bunch of sites ranging from kind of near the Kauai Pu'uko area, and then our farthest south site is down by Captain Cook, and they range in the middle. There's places like Iholo, Kukio, Kahalu'u, Kohaniiki's in there too. But the goal of this was to take those drone surveys and take that structure from motion baseline surveys that we've been doing with divers, and then apply it at this really large scale and collect it with the drones. So kind of working through the workflow of what we do with drones. Timing on this is really key. With most types of structure from motion, with divers, you can do it any type of day. You can do it at nighttime using lights. It's really easy to do. When we're trying to map corals with drones, we have a really small window. It ranges to about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and it has everything to do with the sun angle. So if you guys have ever been flying in, which most of you have probably had to fly in here because it's Hawaii, you know, an island. You're flying in at different times of the day. The ocean surface is going to look something like this. There's a lot of sun glint happening. And this is a kind of a vector or ratio of the angle that the sun is to the horizon and in the relationship that you are to it. And so we don't want our drone images to look something like this. You can't see corals at all in those. We want them to look something like that, where we can see structure, we can see individual colonies, we have really clear water conditions, and we can actually build the structure from motion models with them. And so this again happens between that 10 and 30 degree angle, which for Hawaii at about this time of year, it's between 7:30 and 10 a.m. Once you get closer to 10 a.m., it gets blown out and it looks something like this, but there's a really small window to work there. So what we do when we get to a site, there's this kind of setup to landing of how we do a lot of our surveys. These are some photos that we did from a couple weeks ago at Kahalu'u. It's one of our sites. So before we get to a site, we have to do flight planning. For the drones, it's really nice. It's almost completely automated. So instead of us going out and swimming laps all the time, we can actually kind of like sit out on a couch, you know, hang out, and the drone will do its thing. It'll fly its path, and we just have to make sure that it gets out and back without crashing. But it does it almost entirely by itself, which is really nice. So we set a different type of flight path of an area of interest. We look at target areas of where we're trying to map. And then we like to also do a lot of community involvement. So almost all of our sites, we're working with community partners to try and either launch and land from where they're at, their different locations, or get them involved in the snorkeling session where we do some ground truthing. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I'm going to give you guys kind of like a run through of what a flight path looks like and how it works. So on this side, this is the automated flight path for how it works. This is the simulator for it. So the drone will go from its home location, and it'll fly to its starting point where it gets to. And then as soon as it gets to where it's going to start on this blue flight path, right over here, it'll start taking photos. And what you guys are seeing on this side is that 70 to 90% overlap from photo to photo. So as it moves across those blue lines, and again, these are waypoints that it's given, so we're not actually flying this. We're just telling it, this is the path you're going to fly. Go take photos every 5-10 feet or every 2 seconds to make sure you're getting this type of overlap. It'll go ahead and go fly that. It'll do its whole thing, and then when it's done, it'll go back to its home point. For the simulator, it does its home point in the middle of the map. It doesn't actually launch and land from the middle of the ocean. We usually do it from land. That would not be great. My boss would not be happy if I did that. One thing to note when we're doing these kinds of things, because it's structured for motion, it's looking at stationary targets. So when we get things like waves coming in, generally it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. It won't put those waves or moving objects, things like fish or turtles, won't get incorporated into the maps. But they do cause a lot of issues during the reconstruction section when we're building the 3D models. But it's not the end of the world. In between photos is actually the base map, and I'll show you guys a little bit more of the base map, but all the whitewash kind of gets edited out. That being said, if we're having like 8 or 10 foot swells, we can't really do this very well. And the better the conditions, the better the visibility, the better the maps and the models will turn out. Okay, cool. All right, so just like with the diver-based structure for motion surveys, the methodology transfers across. Our flight path looks like this. Those red dots we were looking at are the same as in the very beginning, are the same as those little blue dots. Each blue dot represents a photo that's taken on that flight path. This is one of the mosaics that we use that came from our Kealakekua surveys from earlier this month. So we have the flight path, all the photos. We took about 8,000 photos to survey from the state park area all the way out to the Captain Cook Monument. We put them all together to make one of those ortho photos. Again, those geo-reference photos where we can measure corals. The resolutions on these are usually less than a centimeter. So each pixel is about a half centimeter XY direction, which is one of those things that we use to measure. So we're able to see individual colonies really effectively. And now with those 3D images or those 3D models, we still like to use the different aspects of that and pull things like structure or reef complexity from the models as well. So we'll build digital elevation models. It's essentially the same thing as a topographic model that you would have that, one of the large NOAA ships with the depth sounders would use, or if you're on a boat, same thing where you're seeing the depth. We can build large maps of those. And so again, these are that singular image. We usually work with about 5 centimeter resolutions for these. Anything below that gets kind of funky in terms of being able to detect change over time. But those are really important. We'll get into that in just a second. Let's see if this is going to go. So this is still with the Kealakekua data. This is the 3D model of just showing the elevation. The red up there is part of the poly or the cliffside. And then once you get into the darker blue section, that's where you're actually in the water. But like you can see here, we get full structure of this entire reef habitat. We can see all the different coral mounds. We can see the boulders on the side of the cliff. And it gives us a really good representation of how the structure in these reefs work. Some of you may be thinking, how deep does this go? We can get as deep as the camera can see. So on really good visibility days in the water, we can get probably down to about 40, 45 feet. Most of the time, on the average, we're going to hit about that 30-foot mark is our pretty much absolute max for your average day. 0 to about 20 foot, we're going to get really good imagery and really good visibility. But anything past that, the cameras have a little bit difficult time seeing. But that still represents a pretty significant portion of reefs in Hawaii in general. All right, so some of the data products of what we have gotten so far. We've done the Kahaluu data products are coming out relatively quickly right now. So this is, again, one of those scales similar to what we were looking at earlier with you have the blown out version here. We have a 200-meter scale now instead of a 10-meter scale. If you follow the yellow boxes, we'll go around and then down. We got 35 meters. We can follow that one, and we can look at individual colonies. So we can zoom in again really close to these ones. We're looking at about 4mm resolutions for the pixels. When we zoom into a 4mm resolution pixel, it just looks like the color of that pixel. We can't actually see polyps. But it is a really fine resolution to be able to scale things at, as well as look at the different changes in growth or reef structure. So different types of data that we collect from this have different uses. Like I've been saying, kind of for the first part of this, mosaics are really good for looking at corals, their assemblages, where they are on reefs, tracking things like coral cover. The elevation maps are one of the things that are really good for assessing structure. So we can use these types of elevation maps. This elevation map corresponds to this mosaic on top of it. So we can track things like the coral structure, how much it grows from year to year, the shape, the depth that it's at. And when we do this across multiple time points, we can assess the growth of a coral of an individual colony and then of thousands of colonies across time points. One of the big things that we'll be looking at in terms of the structure and structural complexity across time points is once we have lots of baseline data across these areas, we can go in again after things like high swell events. If hurricanes hit portions of the coast where we have data, we can see how that structure has changed after a big storm event. And then just things like long-term change. If we do it this year and then waited 5 years, what's the difference in the reef between now and then? All right. So a lot of this is done remotely. Again, the drones, we just kind of kick back, let it do its thing. There is a large portion of actual in-water work. A lot of people are really worried about things like structure from motion or cameras being able to detect fish, taking away the survey jobs. But that's not something we'll have to worry about. All of these things require actual in-water ground truthing. So we do get out of the water. We have this whole setup where we've got a high-resolution GPS on a dive float that's connected to a camera through a waterproof cable. And what we do is we've got a laser on the bottom of that dive float, and the person on the buoy will be pointing the laser over top of a coral. The person with the camera will dive down and take a picture of that coral. And that way we can ping the GPS and create a GPS point linked to a camera photo. And we can put those over top of those larger maps. So when we get kind of a non-great visibility day or kind of a wavy swell action day, we can still have some in-situ pictures to see how that looks. So that looks something like this. All of those blue dots on the screen represent one of those GPS points. You click on it and you can see the picture of the coral. We'll do these large kind of transect tracks. We'll assess lots of different corals over a certain area, and they'll really let us see like what actually looks like. That way, when we have these kind of brown blobs that we're not sure what species they are, we can actually see what those are, and it gives some more information to machine learning. And so the machine learning, I don't have any data for the Hawaii stuff. A lot of this is going to be from our Palmyra work, which is an island in the Line Islands, about 2,500 miles south of here. All the different orange dots are representative of a Acropora species. The blue dots, or the blue polygons, are Poslophora species, things like the cauliflower corals that we have here. And so we're able to do that same thing that we do with the in-water stuff. We do the machine learning work, we tell it what to look for, and then it applies it to a really large area on the drone map. So this is really where we can scale the type of data that we look at. We can scale our level of data collection, and we can apply it not just to, again, those like small transects or small 10 by 10 meter diver areas, but we can do entire stretches of coastline. We can do almost like entire atolls if we want to. Really, the window that we have to work with is time, and it's between that 10 and 30 degree sun angle. But we can do multiple days worth of stuff. For our Palmyra work, we get huge tracts of reef in one go, and then the machine learning aspect of it makes it really spectacular. All right. So we're going to do a slight interactive thing. We're going to see how well it goes. So for you tech-savvy folks, you can break out your phones. If you're not tech-savvy, and for the people online, I'm going to be doing some video stuff on there as well. If you are too far away, it's not working, pass those around. Share them. As you go, you can scan them as well. If that's easy. If you didn't bring your phone, share with the person next to you, but I'm also going to be putting it up here on the screen in just a second. Cool.
That survey that you showed the last one, how long did that take? I mean,
the drone photos?
Yeah.
For the Palmyra work, they did that in a day.
That all happened in a day?
We do it in about an hour and a half.
Wow.
Yeah. We're gonna fly Kapubai Bay outside of Kona Village tomorrow, and we're gonna get about 800 acres in 2 hours.
And what was the orange? What species was the orange?
That was a Acropora. Acropora? We don't have those here yet. All right, we're gonna keep going now. Y'all can scan and go ahead as you will. So this is some of the changeover time work we have. Again, we just started this in Hawaii, so we don't have those data ready. So this is looking at the darker images on this side are going to be January from 2022. The lighter images, which will slide back over in a second. This is January, and then we're going to slide back into November, 11 months later. And so for these ones, pick one coral, just look at one singular coral, you can bounce around. But you can see for a lot of these types of corals, they're growing really fast.
Yeah.
When we do drone work in Palmyra, we actually get to see corals that grow more than 2 centimeters a year. Hawaii, we have to do a longer temporal period to see this kind of change. But we get sometimes 10 inches of growth a year in corals. But this is, again, one of those just kind of visualizations that we have in addition to all of those data products where we can see how the drones are used to benefit. Awesome. All right. So, in conclusion on all of this, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and go into questions. You guys can still keep looking at all the different interactive stuff. Structure from motion is a type of fine-scale remote sensing. We use it to create 3D models of reefs or really anything we want to take images or make 3D models out of. And by flying into coral reefs, we're able to make really high-resolution 3D maps that will give us the tools to be able to measure corals, detect change over time, see the impacts of storm damage. Platforms that we can use this from range from divers, drones, ROVs, boats, and helicopters. And by measuring all the different types of, or by collecting all these different types of data from these 3D models, we can get things like reef structure, the shape of colonies, depth to a pretty good degree, as well as structure and how it changes over time. So with that, we'll take any questions. This QR code is the Kahaluu maps, if you guys want to check out some local stuff as well. Yeah. Question in the back.
Is this data set, is this available yet to government agencies for regulatory purposes? And seeing for, like whether over a period of a couple of years, moorings in a certain spot in particular, or things of that nature for regulatory, or is this simply still just, I want to say proprietary, but held entirely by Nature Conservancy for its selected use for its own projects?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Wait, that was the hard government regulation one to start off with. All right, great. So just to repeat it for everybody, the question was, is this available for government purposes for agencies, I'm guessing like the Division of Aquatic Resources, for folks like NOAA, so they can use it to ask other questions and assess things like the impacts of moorings on reefs and that kind of assessment. The answer to that is multiple parts. So to kind of start off with, a lot of the work that we're doing right now with this type of data is funded through those exact agencies that I believe you're referencing. So most of our funding for this project comes from NOAA, so they get copies of all this data. We work directly with the Division of Aquatic Resources as a partner agency on a lot of things. A lot of the sites that we're doing for this are working with DAR in terms of coral restoration and how those sites are changing over time. So in terms of, are they available to those agencies? At the request of those agencies, they're more than welcome to look at them and use them. A lot of the work we do at the Nature Conservancy isn't siloed, meaning that we're not trying to have these data products to kind of have them in a file and nobody can look at them. For things like when there's research questions are involved, or if there's direct management applications, we're more than happy to share the data to those agencies. So if there was some work that wanted to be done, for example, on things like how structure changed from moorings over time that DLNR or DAR wanted to do, we'd be more than happy to share that information with them. For right now, the data sets are still coming in and still being processed. So there'd be a bit of a buffer time, but it's something that we would be able to share with those agencies at their request if they wanted to be able to answer
this. As a citizen, if I wanted to bring up an issue to them to explore and say, hey, Division of Aquatic Resources or Boating and Ocean Recreation, I think there's an issue over here, such a spot. How would I reference asking them about this specific data? I'd say, can you go look at this, whatever the words are, data set to see if there is in fact historical trend? How would I reference this to an agency person on the phone or email?
Great question. I would have to go back to you. Let's talk after the presentation more. Let me think about that. I would imagine you could talk. They would probably have a different response in terms of the type of data sets that they would use. But let's talk after. I'd love to dig into that question with you. Yeah, question over here.
How did the tides affect the level, high or low tide affect the mapping?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so the question was, how do the tides affect the mapping? I'm guessing you're talking about when we do it with drones, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So for certain areas, we don't really have that many issues with tides. We can do it at high tides, low tides, when the tides are going out and they're coming in. If we're working in areas like Kahaluu or when we do it in Palmyra, I guess the biggest thing is the density of water is so much more. And when you have, if you're working in a 6-foot section, if you have less water that the camera has to look through, you're going to probably have better visibility. So if there's less water there, and it only applies when you're working maybe 6 feet of water. Because if you're looking at a 20-foot depth, the difference between a 20-foot depth and a 22-foot depth of visibility isn't going to be that much. But if you're working really shallow intertidal flats, you're going to get probably better visibility. But I wouldn't say it would make or break any type of survey. Wave action is going to be the main thing that would do that. Question.
How do you assess the coral health in the recent past or right now? In other words, as far as growth or things killing the coral or whatever, you know?
Yeah. So coral health is something pretty tricky to work with drone surveys. We generally don't look at specific diseases or health conditions from a drone. We usually do that with the in-water SFM work. So earlier in the presentation, when we were looking at those different types of health conditions, those are where those coral annotations are really helpful because we can click on individual colonies and we can see what disease or health condition that they have. And then if we have another one of those surveys from a different time point, we can see whether that colony experienced partial mortality. We can see if it has the same level of disease, whether it's changed or not. And we can kind of go back and do that same survey in the same location and see that level of change over time. And so then
what I was asking is, how are things out there?
Oh, how are they? Oh, I got a question. Okay. Way easier question. Okay. For right now, right now we were expecting to be like in the middle of a pretty big bleaching event or moderately large bleaching event. So things are looking good compared to what we were expecting. We're not really seeing any bleaching at all. It's kind of our usual summer bleaching for some of our smaller colonies. Hawaii, compared to places like the Caribbean, doesn't have major coral disease outbreaks. In the Caribbean, you have like the main decline in coral reefs there is either storm damage or coral disease. Here it tends to be bleaching and storm damage. So disease isn't really an issue here. It's usually anywhere between 5 and 10% of the coral population that has some type of health condition that may not necessarily be fatal. It just kind of has it and it's there. It could be as simple as algal overgrowth is impacting that colony. It could be, growth anomalies or tumors, which are more complicated, but again, those are really spotty, and they're only about 2% of the population has those.
No, but how is our reefs healthy right now?
I would say that they're relatively healthy. Yeah. They're not in any type of immediate peril that I have seen.
And they're growing well.
Yes. That's a complicated question.
Yeah.
Hawaii's reefs grow really, really slowly. Like we're looking at like 2 centimeters or less a year and change. In general, watching growth on corals in Hawaii can be really tricky. Certain species grow really fast, like the cauliflower corals. You'll see pretty good growth since 2015. One of our surveys that we've done, the reef resilience surveys, has showed that reefs have stabilized since that major bleaching event. That's not to say that they've recovered. That's just to say that they've stopped dying at the rate that they were dying, which is a really distinct difference. So they're relatively stable at the moment, is I would say what the best answer to that is.
So they're growing back from the previous.
They're not dying. Yeah.
Let's change the subject. Are we anticipating another bleaching like next year then, or?
That is a really hard thing to determine.
Okay.
Yeah, so usually NOAA puts out the Coral Bleaching Watch around January or April is when we get a pretty good lock on it, and it gives like bleaching alert, bleaching warning, and then all kinds of ranges in between then. So it's a little bit too early to determine that now. It was an El Nino this year, which 2015 was an El Nino as well. And so we were expecting, to have higher temperatures and more bleaching now. But I would say it's too far out as to the knowledge that I have of what's happening right now to be able to tell you like if we're going to get bleaching next year.
Where do we go to look for that information if we wanted to see it?
NOAA's got that on the Coral Reef Watch, Coral Bleaching Watch websites.
Okay.
If you Google Coral Bleaching Watch and then NOAA, it'll have all that information there.
How much computing power do you use to do this?
A lot. That we are dealing with that a lot right now. So with the surveys that we just did, we did 120 in-water SFM surveys in August, and that was about 12 terabytes of just raw photos. Each one of the in-water SFM models is about 200 gigabytes for a file size, so really substantial. Most laptops, like my laptop, can only hold 500 gigabytes of data at a time. So we just have hard drives on hard drives on hard drives. So it does take more computing power than you would think. We're currently trying to work out some contracts with a couple of web or cloud-based processing, where we can just upload all of our photos to the cloud and then remote into a server, and we can just kind of get what we need as we go, and then we're not operating on hardware that we have to maintain kind of thing is the way that we're trying to get around that. In the past, people have bought mega computers for this stuff that have, anywhere between 4 and 8 GPUs and, yottabytes of RAM, all kinds of craziness. So yeah, the computer powered, it's not necessarily an easy or cheap type of survey line to get into. There is this almost like a financial barrier to get into these surveys in the sense that you have to buy the cameras, you have to get the drones, the computer powered is really a big factor. You're not necessarily saving on time in terms of the amount of time you're saving in the field to do these surveys. You're making up for that with somebody having to process that in the lab. It's almost an equal trade-off. But I can say for most, not all, a lot of survey divers, if they had to spend 3 hours underwater staring at corals and then do that for 4 weeks, or if they could spend 20 minutes to do an SFM survey and cut that down, depending on who you talk to, it might change.
So the main purpose here is to maybe get a baseline of data, and then so Quintal, you'll be doing this sort of survey again in later months and that sort of thing. Are you hoping to find maybe if there is a bleaching effect, where it's happening and what might be correlated with it as far as water quality or proximity to a outfall or something to that effect?
Yep, excellent question. So for everybody and the people online, the question was, are we doing these as baseline surveys for right now since there's not bleaching? And if there is some type of event later on, that's like a stressor event or bleaching in the future, are we going to look at how these areas compare to each other? And there are other environmental factors like water quality that have kind of lessened or increased that overall stress. So the answer to the first part is yes, these are. We switched these basically we're just doing baseline surveys. We're out getting all of these locations, not to check for bleaching, but to build those initial the maps of the locations as well as the coral maps to go on top of them. So that way, when there is a bleaching event in the future, or when there's a storm response that comes in, we'll be able to have these and we can assess them and compare them to the previous baseline maps. One of the ways that we're using this in particular at the Nature Conservancy is we have the Nature Conservancy currently owns and operates a reef insurance policy, and which is based on storm damage and wind speed from different storm events that come in. And there's really specific rules on how we can define a storm event and get any type of insurance policy kind of payout for that. And it's directly related to reef restoration that we can do with that insurance policy. But one of the things that we can use these surveys for is when the big storm event comes in, we can then send out the drone, we can map that area really quickly, and we can look at what the structure was from our baseline data to what it looked like directly after a storm event, and then we can direct those funds to do reef restoration in areas where we had major structural damage and major structural change over time as a way. We do a lot of in-water work when we do that as well, but we can do, in a single day, we can do those hundreds of acres, versus when we do it with divers, we have to do it with towed surveys. Different types of data, very complementary to each other. One's not better than the other, but they work really well with that. To answer the second portion of that question is if there was a bleaching event, we would be including different types of environmental data, things like water quality, sea surface temperature, all of those things to assess which types of areas, both out of sight and in between sites, had different impacts in terms of bleaching or things like that. But that's going to be a future question, a future body of work, because we have to wait for that to happen, kind of thing. That is one of the really nice things that we like to do when we prioritize working with communities and working with partners, is we don't like to work in silos with these kinds of things. If there are other community organizations or agencies kind of doing water quality work at these sites or doing any type of data collection, we can combine these data sets and have this kind of multifaceted approach and lots of types of data sources coming together all at one time to really kind of give us the full picture of what's happening on our reefs. Jeff.
I've got a bit of a two-parter.
Great.
You mentioned that the machine learnings have an error rate of 2%, right?
It ranges.
Somewhere in there.
Sure.
So the first part of the question is, what is the error rate of human eyeballs on the same image?
That is
What's the error rate for
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there have been a bunch of different studies to preface the answer to this question. There have been a pretty decent amount of studies. A lot of people have had similar thoughts where it's like, we're doing this with machine learning, we're doing this with, remote sensing work, but we've been doing this with divers for so many years, looking at these corals. Divers are going to be better than a computer. And there are 3 major studies that have been done by NOAA, the University of Hawaii, and somebody else did something recently. It'll come to me. But they found all of the different studies found that there's relatively comparable works to be done between in-water diver-based studies as well as the machine learning. Again, a lot of these data sets, they're compatible and comparable across the board. One's not better or the other. There's no real gold standard to look at in terms of survey design. In terms of machine learning versus diver error, you get probably a comparable 2%. I mean, you probably get the same amount of error with machine learning that you would get in the error between one diver measuring a coral and then another diver measuring a coral. You'll also get that same level of error from a diver at the start of a survey method to the end of a survey. The first week of surveys, as I'm sure you know, Jeff, I'm really excited. Everybody's like, let's go count some coral, let's go count some fish. And by week 4, you're like, I'm really tired. I've been counting for a long time.
Machines don't get tired.
Machines don't get tired. Well, they do. They, light on fire and don't like it. Yeah, so it really depends. All of these have caveats. All of the different survey types have caveats. It's how you look at them and then how you adjust for that factor. For the machine learning aspect of it, we can go in and check. I've worked on projects where we checked every single coral that a machine learning, or we had interns do it, but they checked everything and they were like, it does a pretty good job. That's how we got to that 98%, measure. But I would take 98% for machine learning, annotating 12,000 colonies versus me having to annotate 12,000 colonies any day. That sounds great. Question right here.
You mentioned restoration. Describe how you would restore a coral reef or the types of restoration that has been done.
I am going to defer that question to Michaela Barnwell over there. I strongly recommend you talk to her after this talk. She's a coral restoration specialist at the Nature Conservancy, and she can answer that question much better than I can. Yeah. Right.
So I'd like to return to predicting the future health. And black swan events aside, if you look at cauliflower coral, for example, you should be able to see the keiki, determine their age by size, and you've probably got half a dozen years of data now. If you look now, you can see half a dozen years of regrowth.
Yeah.
And from that, predict the recovery rate.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and there are really a ton of really excellent mathematical models. So I think, let me just repeat the question for you, and then for everybody, then if it's not what you were asking, correct me. So the question is, we have lots of data for some of our sites. For Hawaii data, this is our first round of data, but for Palmyra, we have a few years worth of data now. And so we'd be able to look at the recruitment of certain types of corals, like cauliflower corals, and see how often they're recruiting on reefs, when they show up in the drone imagery, how fast they're growing, and then build a mathematical model to predict how the reefs are going to recover over time.
Yes, black swans aside.
Yeah.
Except that I think you only need one set of data because you can tell the age from the size.
Yes.
At least with cauliflowers.
Yeah, so kind of. But I would say the
data is good.
Yeah, no, the analysis portion of on the statistical side, I would say you can't do it with one side. Like, to create a good predictable model, you would need multiple years worth of data. You could do it with 2 years worth of data. I would say probably having 5 to 8 years worth of data, which is a lot of data collection and a long time to wait to answer that question. You could do it technically with 2 years worth of data and get kind of, here's what's happening right now. It wouldn't tell you that long term of a trend past probably 4 years, because you have things like occurrence changing. Even if you didn't have bleaching events or major stressor events coming in, just the dynamics of how recruitment goes for the corals that are already existing. And if we knew the growth rates really well, which for certain species we do, but others are kind of, we're still working on it. it would still be a weird model with only 1 year's worth of data. But you could make a really good model, and that's what a lot of people are doing with this type of data, where we're saying we have this much recruitment, this is the growth that we've determined from these maps, this is the distribution of corals right now, what's it going to look like in 5 years? And if we had, for example, one of these maps, and you had a random recruitment happening across the site, you could have, and it was happening at this density. So we knew exactly per meter squared how many recruits we were expecting every year. You could go into these maps and randomly generate that density across the map. And you could make 15 different models that say, these are where all the new corals are potentially going to land, and here are all the possibilities. And then we could also do, this is what the corals are expecting to grow at, this is what they'll look like in 5 years based on the growth rates that we have now. There's all kinds of other factors within that model that you'd have to do, but that type of assessment is very much doable. But to have it be workable, usable, and then to apply it to reef management, so where the state could use it, or where the federal government like NOAA could use it and apply it to legislation, you'd have to have a really sound mathematical model and then have it proven over the course of previous years' worth of data. So to answer that question, yes, you could do it with 1 year's worth of data, but to have it applied to marine management, you would have to have probably a longer set of data track to have it be, meaningful, I would say. Cool. Question in the back over there.
Just real quick, do you plan on doing this in any other parts of the island?
We're working on it. We would like to do it in other places. It is really, right now, our big thing is funding. Kind of where it's allocated for our funding. So a lot of this is happening where we have big pushes from the community, where we have partner organizations doing work, and where we already have the funding allocated. In the future, I'd like to have this in a lot of different areas so we could track coral over time, and we could make those mathematical models to predict how the reefs are going to look in the future, and have it in a couple of different key environments where there's big human impact, where there's no human impact, where we get freshwater input that's different, where there are fish ponds adjacent to it, all kinds of things like that. So the goal of the future is to do that, but right now we're just sticking with the sites that we have for this year, and then we'll build that out as we go. Yeah, awesome.
Given your data that you have and your modeling of it, does Nature Conservancy have a set of policies with the objective of conserving nature?
Yep.
If you get information that indicates that a bleaching event or some kind of a major stressor is occurring in a certain area, let's say in West Hawaii,
yep.
With that information, do you have a policy, does Nature Conservancy have a plan to outreach to government agencies or others to say alert and to suggest, not just alert, but is there any, is that suggested actions that people should take or shouldn't take given that a major event is seen, so that we can actually together conserve this stressed out, dying resource? What can we do if you know it's going to happen? Is there anything you can tell us that we should or shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, that excellent question on that one. So again, for people online, the question was, is there anything, if we know that something is happening, or if there's a big stressor event that's coming, is there anything that the Nature Conservancy is currently doing, and are they talking to state agencies or to the public to help allow everyone to best understand what they can do to lessen their impact on the reefs during a stress event? That was correct, yep?
Yeah, it's like snorkelers and density of snorkelers and incidental brushing of, in shallow waters with your fins and things like that. Is there some things like that need to be posted and warned, or some kind of control of density where people cluster a lot around these features?
So on the Nature Conservancy side of that, we don't do direct lobbying to the state government about that in terms of asking them. We do work directly with the Division of Aquatic Resources, DLNR, and DOBOR, all of those agencies as partner organizations. Lots of times we'll coordinate with them on surveys, how we're doing outreach media to the public. I wouldn't say we tell them that you guys should do this or this is what we see. Usually they get the same information that we do. Most of the bleaching event information comes from NOAA and the federal government. So when we get it, they also get it at the same time. Lots of times we do strategic planning with other agencies in terms of monitoring and kind of outreach on coral bleaching events or major stressor events so that people can know. I wouldn't say that as of right now we had any type of major communication arm that works with the public at large when it comes to bleaching events. We do things like on social media and things like that, but we don't necessarily have a major outreach campaign that is like an umbrella outreach campaign to what you're describing at the moment.
Yeah, should we just bite our nails, or should we stay away from the reefs during these stress times, or is there anything we can do other than worry about it?
Yeah. So I would say there's a bunch of studies that have been done on coral bleaching and stressor events, and they found that there's a huge percentage of the success or loss of coral depends on local stressors. So there's large global events like coral bleaching that happens worldwide. We can't really control those. But there are things like local stressors for water quality, anthropogenic nutrients going into the ocean, sedimentation from degraded watersheds. All those things make up 80 to 90% of the success or loss of coral cover in some areas. If we address things like water quality, if we address things like sedimentation, if we address the impact that people are putting on these reefs, they're more likely to recover faster than they would if they didn't have those things impacting them. So things like there's the big push on water quality for 2050, everybody changing cesspools to septic tanks or getting sewage treatment plants to reduce that type of anthropogenic effluent going to the ocean. That's huge. There's all kinds of things that are showing that nutrients from cesspools and effluent going to the ocean increases the amount of coral disease on reefs. It has everything to do with the chemical structures and the different types of medicines that are putting into reefs that are coming in through that groundwater discharge. So by doing things, making sure that your homes are switching from cesspools to septic tanks, working with the county planning committees to kind of upgrade our infrastructure as a community, those things will help during those stressor events. And then obviously not on the individual, if we're out snorkeling or scuba diving, if there's a big bleaching event, maybe not kicking corals or scratching them is always super helpful. Yeah. Or, yeah.
Since we have baselines to work with, are we able to assess if there's a positive outcome from transitioning to reef-safe sunscreens?
That's really hard. That's a really tough question. You guys are really doing great asking tough questions. So on an analysis standpoint, having a positive or negative change and having it correlate to the addition or subtraction of reef-safe sunscreen is really hard. Like, you can correlate those things, but correlation doesn't necessarily at all mean causation. With these types of maps, it's a lot of looking at like instantaneous snap events. When there's bleaching, we can map that. When there's storm events, we can map that. When it comes to things like water quality, correlating reef, growth, degradation, disease to things like sunscreen is really difficult to do. That would be great, in lab experiment to test out with Hawaiian species to see how it works. We don't have baseline data for Hawaii going back far. Like, this is our first round of baseline data. We collected it 2 weeks ago. So it's not quite old enough yet to show major change, but in the future, like, there might be types of correlation assessments we can do, but those are really questions that are best answered in a lab and then tested largely with lots of moving parts kind of thing. The question over there.
Have these types of surveys been thought of potentially for like any new land development next to the coast so that you can easily monitor progress and impact of development along the coast?
Yes, and maybe.
Seems like a great selling pitch to make sure every new resort has to have one of these and monitor it.
Yeah.
That's part of the funding to promote your.
Yeah, so like it would be really great. That hasn't been talked about largely. Love that idea. One of the things that we are doing right now, in terms of that, like, like a disturbance event in terms of like land use change. So we do a lot of work in the watersheds in Pelikone and Honokoa, which are in the Waihai area. They all filter and kind of funnel down into the Waihai Gulch area at the harbor there. So for those of you, all of you who were probably on island, there was the big Mauna Kea fire that happened a couple weeks ago. We are doing a lot of surveys with these exact types of surveys right now where we're mapping the fire area. We're working with the landowners directly. We're working with people in the county to track how sedimentation and the exposed fire area and the exposed sediments are moving down, and we're using a combination of structure from motion and LiDAR, and we'll be able to track where the sediment from that fire area is moving from that watershed down into the ocean, and then where it's settling on the reef as well, and doing kind of like a sedimentation smothering situation.
These last couple of questions just made me think of the situation at Mahukona, where I forget the name of the group, but they're trying to raise the money by December 15th to buy the land to preserve it, so that it doesn't become a resort up there. Have you done any surveys or mapping of that area? Because it seems like before all of that blows apart, it'd be good to get a baseline.
We have not done surveys up there. I know DAR has some fish surveys and some benthic surveys up there, but they haven't done drone surveys up there. We do work in Kohala a lot on a lot of our things. Also, our director lives up there too, so I'm sure she's aware of it. But as of right now, we don't plan to do surveys out of Mahukona. But these are the types of surveys that if there was like, again, like you were saying, like if you had a big development, you'd be able to see kind of change over time, or you'd be able to at least monitor the reefs and say that these reefs are changing. It wouldn't necessarily tell you, again, because it's correlation versus causation when you have things like you're putting in a hotel kind of thing. You'd be able to say it's correlated to a degree, but you don't exactly know. But if you did it enough times, you would get an idea kind of if it happened or not. It would also take a lot of involvement with that. We worked historically with hotels when they're doing renovations. We've done surveys in front of them to kind of see what those renovations were. I can't tell you the results of those surveys off the top of my head, but it's one of the things that we've done in the past. So I'm sure we'd be able to do that kind of thing in the future. So, do you have a question?
It was really totally off the wall, and I don't really expect you, but is there any way of measuring the amount of sunscreen chemicals in the water?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
They have those parts per million tests.
Yeah, probably.
Is there any way of using this photography to measure chlorophyll levels, and that might correlate to nutrient pollution as well?
Yeah, so there's a whole suite of surveys that we can do. So with these types of surveys, we're just using a normal camera, like an RGB camera, the red, blue, green, visible spectral things, what we can see, the camera can see. There's a whole additional type of surveys that you can do called multispectral surveys that allow you to see different types of non-visible spectral light that indicate different types of chemicals in the water. It probably wouldn't do sunscreen very well, but you'd be able to see things like chlorophyll would ping differently from those different types of light spectrum than they would just with the RGB spectrum. So we're working, I would really like to add that. That's a very expensive camera to add to the drone. And it's something that I would have to, it would be nice to do in the future with that kind of thing, but there's a whole additional complexity and layer to do those types of things. Chlorophyll you can kind of get from just a normal camera. You don't get really high resolution chlorophyll data. And it depends where you're working at. If you're working in Kahaluu, you might not necessarily have a comparable chlorophyll read from an RGB camera that you would if you were in front of Kiholo is one of our other sites that gets a higher chlorophyll near the fish pond where there's higher nutrients coming in. So there's more chlorophyll near the coast in those areas versus some other areas. So it's hard to compare those kinds of things. Satellites do a really good job these days though with chlorophyll. So there are the really coarse resolution maps are like maybe, I think they're like 5 kilometer chlorophyll maps, which for like near coastal shore areas, and depending on the community and specific question, it might not be high enough resolution. But you can do it with drones, it just takes a whole level of additional types of surveys. Yeah.
How many species of coral are we looking at in this area, approximately?
In Hawaii, there's about 75 species of coral that we look at. With the drone stuff, we can pick up about I would say 15 is a really high number. That's too high. I'd say we can get about 5 species of coral relatively okay that we'll be able to detect is in that. And those are because they're going to be larger reef building species. We can get probably more genus than species for corals. Of those like 75 species of coral that we're looking at in Hawaii, a lot of them don't get bigger than like this big. They're really small. Okay. Any other questions?